Hello, folks. Um, Today we're going to talk about the Cold War, uh, which basically we see here the Soviets, we see here the Americans. They're going to be the two power um, players in the world post World War II. And what we see is this Cold War goes on from 1945, which is the end of World War II, to about 1991. But basically, when you think of the Cold War, you want to think of the Soviets, communism, versus the Americans, capitalism. This is an ideological war. Okay. So, objectives. Understand the definition of Cold War. Who is involved? What is it? When did it occur? There's two wins there. Why and how. And identify how this sort of Cold War is fought. And you can always pause to write down what you need and then start back up again. Okay? Here we go. So what is a Cold War? Okay? So the definition that I want you to write is it's a period of diplomatic hostility among nations without direct armed conflict. Okay? Um, the Cold War, a couple of times, gets pretty close to Soviets and Americans fighting, but by and large, there is no direct armed conflict between Soviets and Americans, right? We'll talk later about proxy wars. There are wars, but they're never directly between the Americans and the Soviets, okay? So what we see here in this map is post-World War II, we've kind of split up who gets what, right? So pretty much everything west of here, right, is going to be part of NATO, which we'll talk about. But basically, they're going to be allies with the United States. And by and large, they're going to be capitalist democracies. Over here, what we see is communist. These areas here were basically given to the Soviets at the end of World War II. What's important to note here is right in here, we see that Germany itself is going to be split. Okay? West Germany being capitalist democracy, East Germany being communist. Now, in fact, Berlin, which resides in East Germany, is also going to be split. But for the purpose of this lecture, we're really not going to get into that. So, let's go. So here's the definition. Period after World War II focused on tensions between the two most powerful countries that emerged from the war, the U.S. and the Soviet Union. For more than 40 years, they attempted to influence other nations to adopt capitalism or communism. And what I want you to get down is that this is an ideological war. Basically, communists want to spread communism as the main ideology, and Americans want to spread capitalism as the main ideology. And them being the two most powerful nations after World War II, basically we want to think, how are they going to influence these areas? How would you, so I just want you to think about it for a second. If you were one of these nations, how would you get other nations to join your ideology, whether it be capitalism or communism? And I know I'm not here or whatever, but if you say it out loud, you're more likely to remember it. So, pretend we're in class. What would you do? Oh, I would blah, 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 right? So think about how you would influence. So remember, communism spread in the 1800s. Can anyone remember who started communism? Say it out loud if you can. That's right, Karl Marx. And it was created. Why was communism created? Think about that for a second, right? It was created as a response to the horrible treatment of the industrial working class, okay? Once again, communism was focused on overthrowing the means of production, the capitalists, make a society that was equal for everyone, okay? Russia, China, Vietnam, and Cuba eventually become communist during this Cold War, but remember, the first nation to embrace it was Russia, right, under Lenin, okay? Then it changes under Stalin, and that's who's going to be the leader for a good chunk of the Cold War, Stalin. Okay. Very similar to this sort of spread of democracy. If we go into the last time period, 1750 to 1900, when we talk about the American Revolution, right? The American Revolution kicks out the British, and we see this democracy that was inspired by the Enlightenment, right? Spreading to all these different areas. France, Haiti, Latin America, okay? Very similar. So, how do you fight a Cold War if there is no direct war, right? And there's a few ways, okay? So, first and foremost, you need to have the threat of force and power. We need to have arms, technology, and influence. What we're basically talking about are bombs, right? You need to be able to have the threat that if things go down, you have the bombs, the artillery, the manpower to actually invade and take over. Okay, and we're going to break up into two sides: NATO, which is the U.S. and its allies; the Warsaw Pact, the Soviets and their allies. Okay, they're going to be the two military alliances. If one gets in trouble, you have the alliance; you get their back. Okay. The use of propaganda. The propaganda during this time period, just like we've seen in World War I and World War II, is going to be used to push the ideas of whether it's capitalism or communism into the followers, right? America propaganda is going to make people fear communism and the Soviets. Soviet propaganda is going to do the exact opposite. Right? It's going to make people fear capitalists. At one point, there is actual real propaganda that suggests that Americans created that said that communists eat their babies, and communists created propaganda that said American capitalists eat their babies, right? The whole point was to kind of create this fear, this hatred, this paranoia of the other side. Propaganda. Okay, so that's one way it's going to be fought. Also, send economic aid to weaker nations to spread influence and gain allies. At the same time that we have the Cold War, we also have decolonization, which we'll talk about next week. Okay, so we have these areas that have been under control by a European or Japanese area for a very long time. They're just getting their newfound independence, and the Soviets and the Americans are like, hey, join us. Here's some money. You want to become capitalist, right? So economic aid to weaker nations. And then lastly, support allied nations in conflicts to protect interests or agitate other sides. Sponsor wars, proxy wars, right? And the good example of these will be the Korean conflict, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. Okay. So extreme competition is really what I want you guys to be thinking about. Okay. After World War II, the Americans and the Soviets emerged as the new world powers, and it's competition between communism and capitalism. And we see it in all sorts of different ways this war being fought, just outside of trying to get other nations to convert to either capitalism or communism. We see it in an arms race, okay, including nuclear bombs. At one point, the Americans have X amount of nuclear weapons, so then the Soviets want X amount, and it just keeps on racing. They keep on building more and more bombs. At one point, there was enough bombs, if you combine the amount that the Americans and Soviets had, that would blow up the entire Earth 6 times. Okay? So we see the madness here, right? Like, they have 6 times the amount of bombs needed to destroy the whole world, but if the other side has more bombs, they're going to build more bombs, right? It all goes back to this idea of who's the best, right? And if you're the best in any way, it illustrates that your ideology is therefore the best, right? So who has the most bombs? The race to develop space technology, right? The Soviets put the first person in space, right? The Soviets put the first satellite in space. The Americans are the first ones to go on the moon. All of these exercises illustrates the ideology being superior, right? We're able to do this, therefore communism or capitalism is, superior. Attempts to gain support from third world countries, for sure, right? You want to spread your ideology. So third world countries are these newly developed countries that were once colonies, and you want them to join your side, whether it's capitalism or communism. Okay, and even the Olympics, we see in the Olympics that gold medal counts, right? Whichever side has the most gold medals is the best. This illustrates something. This might illustrate that our ideology is the best, right? I want you to think of extreme competition between these two. Okay. So we have the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end World War II, and these bombs becoming more powerful. An example is the hydrogen bomb. The United States exploded the first H-bomb, 1952, in the South Pacific, completely destroying one island. Of course, within a year, we have the Russians exploding one. This kind of connects to that arms race, right? You have this, then we'll have this, okay? And there's the one that the Russians exploded. Okay, what we see here in this map is countries that are going to embrace communism during the Cold War, right? So this is a huge deal, Cuba. This is a huge deal for the Soviets because by and large, it's just one block here, right? And the Soviet Union is going to be surrounded by many allies to the Americans, right? When Cuba becomes communist, that's a big deal because finally it's on this hemisphere. They have a communist nation 90 miles from Florida, and that freaks America out for sure. And we'll talk more about that later. But here's a little breakdown of areas that become communist during the Cold War. So I want you to take a look at this real quick, pause it, and play the little game that we always do. What's happening? What's literally happening? What's symbolically happening? What's the big picture here? So just pause and tell me what's going on in this picture. So what's going on in this picture, we see this man with a mustache, obviously the hammer and the sickle, illustrating Stalin. We see a hoop that says European recovery. What we see is the Marshall Plan. Someone has shot the Marshall Plan, probably, an American shooting this up, and the Marshall Plan is heading towards European recovery. And we see, can he block it? Can Stalin block the Marshall Plan, right? Why would he want to block the Marshall Plan? Okay, here we go. So, 1947, we have the Marshall Plan. What was it? It was a United States program of economic aid to European countries to help them rebuild after World War II. We learned our lesson after World War I. The Treaty of Versailles was a mess. It was too punitive. It punished Germany too severely, and it allowed for authoritarian leaders to come in and take hold. To counteract that this time, the Americans start the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan is focused on providing food, machines, and other materials to European nations to help stabilize Europe, okay, to prevent communism from spreading to these areas. So of course, Stalin doesn't want the Marshall Plan to be heading in these places because they'll become more stable and they'll become connected to America capitalist systems. Okay, so once again, the Marshall Plan was a way to give money to struggling nations to help them after World War II. The Marshall Plan, great example. I'll show you this next picture here. This is Germany, right? So the Americans gave and lent millions of dollars to help stabilize Germany, right? So what we see here is this is Stuttgart, Germany in 1947. This is Stuttgart, Germany in 1955. And what we see is due to the Marshall Plan, they're able to build, right? It becomes more stable, and stable areas are less likely to embrace authoritarian leaders, okay? So the Marshall Plan, got to know it, right? System where money was given to areas to stabilize them to prevent the spread of communism after World War II, the Marshall Plan, okay? Make sure you're familiar with the Marshall Plan. All right, background. After World War II, the U.S. and the USSR emerged as rival superpowers. Each nation was strong enough to greatly influence world events. On this side, we have Truman, who was President of the United States, Eisenhower, and then over here we have Stalin and Nikita Khrushchev, who are the leaders of Soviet Union. Okay. Now, satellite nations you need to be aware of. Satellite nations are these little areas right here that are going to be taken over by the Soviet Union. Okay? Stalin never allowed truly free elections. Instead, communist governments were installed in these areas. The main purpose of these satellite nations was a buffer to protect itself from an invasion from the West. The Soviets were concerned that they would be invaded, and this was a buffer zone before they could enter the Soviet Union, satellite nations. Okay, so how are we going to fight this? Okay, how do we fight it? It's called containment policy, and it's perfect. I mean, the situation that we're in right now. Okay, I want you to think of communism like a disease in the eyes of the American public. Okay, so what do you do with a disease? You contain it, right? You don't allow it to spread. So the policy of containment was the United States will not get rid of communism. You can't get rid of it. Okay, we're not going to go into China. We're not going to go into the Soviet Union, but we're going to try to prevent it from spreading. Okay, this is containment's used in the exact same way with the disease, right? You lock it off and you don't allow it to spread. So the easy analogy here for thinking about containment is they viewed it almost like a disease, like an illness. So the places that are already communist, they're going to be communist. How are we going to fight this? We're going to prevent it from spreading other places. Okay, that's the containment policy. So be familiar with that because that's the main way that the Americans are going to engage, especially early on, with fighting this. Okay. During this time period as well, in order to further that end, the CIA is created. Okay, and they're going to use spies to gather information abroad and carry out covert operations to weaken governments or overthrow governments. Especially, we'll see this in Latin America, right, where government looks more and more socialistic or communist. The CIA would try to overthrow these leaders and put in even dictators that were anti-communist, right? And America was famous for doing this in Latin America. Batista, right? The leader of Cuba before Castro took over was, an American transplant. Salvador Allende, which was a democratically elected socialist, was put down with the help of the Americans, and we installed a leader. And the CIA is known for doing this, right? Basically overthrowing governments who are unfriendly to the United States. What does that mean? Governments that seemed communist or were straight up communist. The CIA is created during this time period. So the world's going to be split into three groups. We have NATO, which is the United States and its allies that embrace democracy and capitalism. And we have the Warsaw Pact, which is the Soviets and its satellites that are communist. The third group is the non-aligned movement. And the non-aligned movement, as you can see here, most of them are going to be newly independent nations. And the last thing that they want to do is create an alliance or some sort of connection with these places that they just broke away from. India is a great example. India, Egypt, and Yugoslavia. Now, India and Egypt are going to be democracies that are capitalist. Yugoslavia is going to be communist, but they refuse to align themselves with NATO or Warsaw Pact. So that's that kind of third option, the non-aligned movement. We don't want to be connected. Okay? So here's just a breakdown of NATO. Establish a system of collective defense whereby its member states agree to mutual defense. So if anybody in here messes with anybody else, we got their back, right? We got the U.S., UK, Canada, France, Denmark, Iceland, Italy, Norway, Greece, West Germany. It's still around today. But basically, I want you to think of America and its allies versus the Warsaw Pact, which is going to be the communist response to NATO. Okay? Same sort of thing, it's just on the other side. So Albania, Bulgaria, Hungary, East Germany, Poland, Romania. And that's going to be the Warsaw Pact. Okay? And then we see it here once again. Basically, after World War II, this sort of line that divides everything in Europe to the west is mostly NATO. To the east is Warsaw. And then some of these are just not aligned, right? They're staying out of it. Okay? So why wasn't this war just fought between the United States and the USSR? They have these huge problems. And that's what, it's a problem between capitalism and communism. It's a problem between the United States and the Soviet Union. Why didn't they just duke it out, right? Why didn't they just say, you know what? Here's the problem. Let's fight it out. Whoever wins, that's the ideology that wins. The main reason for that is something called MAD, mutual assured destruction. Okay? And the idea is if that war started directly between the United States and the Soviet Union, at some point, one of them would use their H-bombs. One would drop an H-bomb, which would cause the other side to drop an H-bomb, which would cause another side to drop an H-bomb. So the idea is the amount of nuclear bombs that they had, once the war starts, we have mutually assured destruction, that everything would go to hell, right? So instead of fighting directly, we have these proxy wars. But the argument is, because there's always kids like, so why didn't they just fight it out? The argument is, if it did happen that way, a nuclear holocaust would have happened, because we would have dropped bombs, they would have dropped bombs, and no one wants to destroy the world. But this picture is a good illustration that it's constantly there, right? Sort of like this. In this picture, we have Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy, and they're arm wrestling, like, I'll do it, don't make me do it. Okay, so the reason that it didn't happen was because of this idea of mutually assured destruction. Okay, that's the end for this. Do the assignment that's on there, review the notes, know the terms, and we'll have another lecture tomorrow. Hope it was pretty easy.